So, did the walls of Jericho come tumbling down? Well, this is the story of Jericho is an incredible story. It's a huge moment in the narrative of the Bible because it represents the very beginning of God fulfilling His promise to give them the land of Canaan. And so we're going to talk about the archaeology, but before we do, did anybody watch any of the Bible series on TV? Okay, so it's interesting, the Bible series, after talking to people, a lot of people said, I watched it, but at least half the time I was trying to figure out if that actually happened that way. Because, a lot of times, especially some of the Old Testament Bible knowledge, we got most of it, at VBS, or at that moment in our life, and when we have to engage kind of seriously with it, we end up in a place where we're like, I'm not really sure. So we're going to go through the story to kind of refresh our minds as to what Jericho was all about. So if you remember, Moses leads the people out of Egypt, and the crossing of the Red Sea, and all of that, and then they go to Mount Sinai, and they're waiting for the 10 Commandments, right? They're waiting to receive the 10 Commandments there. And while they're waiting, they get impatient and they make an idol. And they begin worshiping this idol. And God's not so happy. As a matter of fact, He's like, Moses, I'm going to kill them all. And we'll just start over with you, if you're good with that. And then Moses pleads the case of the Israelites and comes down and God backs down. He doesn't kill them all, thankfully, but He does say that this is a horrible, stiff-necked, disobedient generation, and those people are not going to see the promised land that I have promised, right? And so the consequence is that they end up wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, and during that 40 years, that whole generation dies off. But the really tragic part of it is that there's a very important person that is a member of that generation, Moses, right? And so the curse, the consequence of their disobedience is upon Moses too, and so he never gets to go to the promised land. But at the very end of his life, he goes up to Mount Nebo, and he sees the promised land, and he and Joshua are there, and Joshua's going to take the reins after him and lead them out into the promised land. And so Joshua goes down the mountain, but Moses does not. And then it's time to go to Jericho, right? Now, but before there, in between them and Jericho is a river. And so that's the very first task that Joshua has. How do we cross the river? And Joshua says, I saw Moses do it, right? and so he says, what we'll do? We'll take the people who have the Ark of the Covenant, we'll put them at the front. And if they just start walking into the river, the river should part. And then they can kind of stand in there with the walls, with the river part, and everybody can walk through on dry land. And so they walk up with the Ark of the Covenant, they get to the water, and that's what happens, right? The water parts, they walk through, which I think for Joshua was a really, he's trying to fill Moses' shoes, right? And the first thing, I'm sure I would, if I was him, I'd walk up and I'm like, really? Crossing another body of water, that's my first thing? Of course, I'm going to be compared to him on this, right? But it works out great, and everybody's really happy with Joshua as their leader. And so they cross, and then they say, what we need to do? We need to go and send some spies into the city to kind of check things out and see what's going on. So the spies go and they cross the wall, and they end up in this prostitute's house. And her name is Rahab. As a matter of fact, an interesting thing about Rahab is when in the Bible, when they list the genealogy of Jesus, she's in there. She's in Jesus' genealogy. It's a pretty big deal, right? So anyway, these spies go in, and they're hiding out in her house. And it says, her house was part of the wall of Jericho, and it was kind of made there. And so there's a moment where she can kind of like, they're on the outside and she can call out to them and say, hey, it's safe, it's all clear. And so Rahab like is very nice and kind to the spies and says, please don't, destroy me with all of this. And so the spies come back, they report back, and Joshua says, all right, now it's time to go, right? It's time to go in and conquer the city. So they start out, they head out, and on their way out, they meet an asparagus. No, wait, that's the VeggieTales version, I'm sorry. I've seen it too many times, I get confused. They meet an angel. And the angel stands there, and he's a pretty, at least this angel, he's a pretty beefy looking guy. And Joshua, I love it, he asks him, he says, are you with us or with them? He wants to know, are we going to have to fight you? Because I'm not feeling that right now. And so he says, no, I'm with neither, I'm with the Lord. And he says, but here's what you're going to do. And so in Joshua chapter 6, he says, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them, sound a long blast from the trumpets. Have all the people give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the people will go up, every man straight in. So that's what they do. That was Joshua chapter 6, verse 3 through 5. So that's the plan. The first city, we're not going to fight. Right? We're not going to pull out the swords. Instead, we're going to pull out the musicians. And we're going to rock them down. Right? And so they do it. And that, I think, is really to Joshua's credit as the leader. Right? God asked him to do something absolutely absurd. But he does it. Because that's what God said to do. So they do it. They walk around the city. They do that whole thing. And the walls fall down. And when the walls fall down, they go in and they burn it all. That's what they were instructed to do. They burn it all and then leave it. They don't occupy it. They leave it there, just kind of destroyed. I love this story. I think this is a story that I can remember growing up in many different places. I remember enacting this story in all of my different pieces of church, right? I remember it was one of my favorite things that I did when I worked with children. We got a bunch of these shirt boxes and we painted them like stones. We built up this wall and we had the children walk around 7 times and then yell. And one kid got to be God behind the wall and would, smash it. And we did it about 10 times. Because it was awesome, right? And I think that this story it's one of these stories that you hear it once and you don't forget it, right? You hear it, it's in your mind because the idea is so absurd. The other thing is, talking about archaeology, the details in this story are very easy to investigate, right? You're going to see walls, you're going to see crumbled walls, and you're going to see burnt things, right? So if you find Jericho, you can very easily figure out whether or not this story happened the way it did. It said it did in the Bible. So, I told you that we know where it is. It's a place called Tel Es Sultan, and this is it, right there. That's Jericho. A lot of it's been excavated. A whole lot of it has been excavated. It's one of the most often studied sites in all of this ancient Near Eastern archaeology. It's a brilliant site. It's really beautifully done. And you can find out an enormous amount of information. There's a great volume of kind of overview of all of this archaeology. It's like 4 volumes long, and Jericho is just massive, the amount of information we have from Jericho. So the interesting thing here is that there's a unique layout to this city. And the layout is there's 2 walls of the city. There's the outer wall, the one that's in orange there. It's the really strong wall. It's the wall that's going to keep lots of people out. It's called the revetment wall. That's the outer wall. And then that yellow line, the yellow line is the interior wall. It's the nice, pretty wall, right? It's the fine china wall that you really want to present to the dignitaries, right? And so you have all the great, beautiful gates and that kind of stuff happens in that wall. The really interesting thing about this is that in between these 2 walls are buildings, right? I hope you can see that. In between those 2 walls, there's buildings. The interesting thing about these buildings is that they're really poorly constructed. Whereas the ones inside might have a wall that's 2 bricks thick, these have 1 brick thick, right? Very poorly constructed. And so, the archaeologists who unearthed this part of it said, the way to understand what this is these are the houses that are on the wrong side of the tracks, right? These are the houses. This is the neighborhood that you don't want to really hang out in. You don't want to really spend too much time in. And they're so poorly constructed that they will often use the wall itself as part of the building. So I made a little star right here. That's some of the roofs of some of those structures. And see, but here's the deal. This is exactly what the Bible talks about Rahab's house being. Like right here. The bad part of town where the prostitute's house is. Right? And in this part of town, the part of town that you don't really want to hang out in, those houses are built kind of onto the wall. Just like it says in the story. And so it's very quiet. I don't know if that's hers, but one of these houses, that's where she was. That's where the spies were hiding. And so she could actually call out over the wall to the spies and say, okay, it's okay, you can climb in now. Now, when you took a city in this part, I'm sorry, I get too excited to advance my slides. All right, so when you lay siege to a city, when you conquer a city in this time period in 1400 BCE, the typical technique was to kind of just cut off all of the supplies to the city. All the people who would bring in food or anything that you need, you just cut it off. And you maintain this perimeter, and eventually you starve the city to death, right? They eventually run out of food and water and all that kind of stuff, and then you kind of wear them down that way. And so throughout this part of the world, when you find cities that have been destroyed in a battle, there's a lot of things you don't find in them. And the main thing you don't find in them is you don't find food, right? You don't find grain. And that's because they exhausted it, and their city was depleted, and after they were totally weak, that's when you storm the city. But Jericho is different. Though there is a destruction there, though there is a place where you can see that the city was destroyed, in that same layer you find this. Now it's in black and white because this piece of the dig was done before they had they used colored photography. But this right here, these outside, this is a pot. Everything was done in pottery. And so this is a big pot. And inside it is full of grain. Full of grain. As a matter of fact, there are pots that have never been opened. They're totally full of grain. This pot has been opened, and so this grain reveals something really interesting. it reveals that the grain has been burnt. So there's lots of signs of fire in that destruction layer. So what this says is that this city was destroyed not by cutting off everything that's coming in. Whatever happened here, it wasn't a long siege. It wasn't a long time of cutting off their food supply. It happened suddenly, but while everybody still had full jars of grain. That also is totally consistent with the Bible, right? 7 days. 7 days isn't that long, right? So it matches. And then, of course, the burning, the evidence of burning, it matches the story as well. But the real question is the walls, right? The part of the story that everybody remembers is not the fact that it happened really quickly. It's not the fact that they burned it after they conquered it. It's that the walls fell down, right? And so what you want to find when you go to this city is you want to find this in this destruction layer. You want to look at the city walls, and you want to see significant damage, that the walls themselves were significantly damaged. So they've done that. You could actually kind of see it in the very first picture that we showed, but it's difficult. And so there's been an artist that kind of rendered that picture with a drawing to make it a little bit more clear. And so let me show you what they found when they dug it up. That's it. They find throughout the wall evidence consistent with an earthquake. That the walls crumbled. That the walls sustained damage that was not from a battering ram, that was not from any sort of battle, but that there was some sort of natural event like an earthquake. I don't know about you, but I can go with earthquake, right, in the Bible. 7 times, a loud shout, and then an earthquake happens, right? That earthquake is what God uses to make the walls fall down. And I'm sure if you were Joshua, and an earthquake happened as soon as these guys blew the horns and yelled, that was very clear what was going on, right? So all of that is very, very consistent with the ways. And so throughout the city, actually, there's evidence of the earthquake happening, not just to the walls. And so, they actually, when that earthquake happened, they went in, and that's why there's all the cracks in the buildings and that kind of stuff in that image. They went into a city that was just falling apart, right? So there is one problem, though. And I'm sorry, that's a great picture. So this is the destruction layer that I was telling you about. So right here you see the wall, okay? And then you see part of the wall that is actually crumbled. So these are the bricks, right? This is the part that was okay. And then right here you see the evidence with all these bricks kind of coming apart. All of this stuff is consistent with an earthquake, right? I don't know. That makes me excited when I see that, right? That is the Indiana Jones find that I'm looking for, right? But there is a problem, and the problem really is in the dating. So from the very beginning, there has been a difficulty in dating this site. So the Bible, the difficulty really is partly because the Bible is so specific. It tells you we can date Jericho exactly. Jericho happened on April 20th, 1400 BCE. Right. That's according to the Bible. You can track it back. You got the day. All right. So we've got a really specific, very firm date in the Bible. And so there's not a lot of wiggle room with that. So the first guy who came, he came in the 1930s, this guy named Garstang, and he said it's going to be in the 1400s. It was pretty consistent with the Bible, with what the Bible said. Then later in the 1950s, there's a lady named Kathleen Kenyon. And Kenyon came in, and after she looked at it, she looked at the pottery, and remember last week we talked about a whole lot of dating of archaeological sites comes from the pottery in those layers. And so she took the pottery, she had to recalibrate the dating for the destruction layer, and that says it happened in 1550 BC. Then in the 90s, a guy named Brian Wood comes back after Kenyon and looks at her practices, and a lot more pottery has been found since then, and so they've got some different dates. And he comes back and he says, no, it's 1410. Like, this dates to 1410. And when you're talking in terms of something that happened that many thousands of years ago, 1410 might as well be 1400, right? And so you've got in the 90s. Brian Wood says that, and then finally now we are back to it being way earlier, it being in the 1500s. Now when I read that, and I'll tell you, this was some of the most frustrating research I've ever done, because you read an article, you're like, oh, it matches the Bible, great. And then you're trying to find something else, and you're like, wait, this guy said it doesn't match. Okay, and then you go through and you're like, oh wait, but it does. Oh, but it doesn't. Oh wait, it does, right? And when you see that, what that says to me is, we're not really sure, right? Because if history has taught us anything, somewhere in maybe the next 10 to 30 years, somebody's gonna say, it matches. And really, when you talk about, we're talking about 1400 BCE, so that's 3,500 years ago or so. I think within 150 years, which is the range that we've got, within 150 years is pretty darn close. And so if I had to guess, I'm going to just say, with everything matching biblical text as closely as it does, either the very specific date in the Bible is off, or this is off, or somewhere, because it just is too good of a match. It's too good of a match to say that they're two different events. And so, what that means is, the walls did fall. The walls of Jericho fell down in an earthquake. But the really weird thing, if you read the text, and if you know what's going on in that part of the world, is that they burned it and left it. See, Jericho is in this really important spot. Jericho is in between these two main roads, the Via Maris and the King's Highway. That's actually one of those roads. It's in between these two roads, and it turns out that when you have two major highways, two major trade routes, that cities are kind of always there. Like when 65 and I-10 meet, you have a city there. Right? When 85 and 65 meet, there's always a city there. And you always have cities in these regions where there's these main highways. And not only is it in between these two huge roads, but it's one of the main entrances to this whole region. It's one of the main entrances to Canaan. And so you want a big, strong, powerful city right there. But God tells them, after they take it, to burn it and leave it. And that's what happens. For hundreds of you've got this site that you can see layers and layers and layers of development. Right? For a long time, there's always a city here. This is an important part of the world. There's always a city here. Then the destruction happens and it's empty. They don't occupy it. They do exactly what God said. And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But if you read the Bible and you were tracking along with this story, you'd understand a little bit. First off, there's two kind of patterns that God has in the way He interacts with the Israelites. The first thing is called a first fruits offering. So throughout their time, God asks that whenever they have an important thing happen, whenever they reap a large harvest, whenever they slaughter an animal, whenever they do whatever it is, that you take the first and the best of it and you give it to God. Because they realize that no matter how good I am at putting seeds in the ground and pruning plants, it's got to rain. And if God doesn't send the rain, ain't nothing going to happen, right? And so this whole thing, this whole first fruits offering was a way for them to constantly recognize that God was their provider. Or that this is not about my strength, not about my power, not about any of that. It's all about God providing for me and me giving thanks and giving it back. And so they would give this first fruits offering back. And so that's what we see here very clearly. There's going to be other battles where there's swords and all that kind of stuff, and body counts and the whole deal. But this one is different. This one is the Lord's. This one is there to remind them that this whole military campaign that they're about to embark on and ultimately be successful in has nothing to do with their strength, has nothing to do with their leader, has nothing to do with their military minds, and it has everything to do with the power of God, that God is the one who's going to give this to them. That's the first thing. The second thing that it really reveals is this is a main entrance into their world. So when they come into and out of this region, they're going to be passing by Jericho. They're going to be seeing this all the time. And this is a practice that you can see throughout the Old Testament. What happens is God does something really big, and oftentimes it's translated as they set up an altar to the Lord. And really it's a pile of rocks, and they'll put these big piles of rocks to commemorate that this place, God did something really important. If you've ever sung the song, Come Thou Fount, it says here, I raise my Ebenezer. That word Ebenezer is talking about those piles of rocks. And so the piles of rocks were there to remind them of what happened. And so that you would go there, you would pass by this pile of rock, and you would say, that's where God promised that he would make my family a nation, right? Abraham would pass the pile of rocks and say, that's it. And it was a reminder to him of what God did there, but it was also a reminder that even in this difficult time, I can look at that pile, that place right there, and I can remember that that's what God said. And that pile of rocks was also a sign to me saying, I need to continue to trust in that promise. And that's what Jericho has. It is a really big pile of rocks. And it's a really big pile of rocks that they're going to pass a whole lot. And that big pile of rocks is going to remind them every time they pass it, first, of God's power, and second, that when God says he's going to do something, it's going to happen. When God says he's going to give you the promised land, even if it takes 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, it will happen. And the other thing is any time that an outside person comes in, anytime that somebody decides they're going to invade God's people, they have to pass by and see what God did. They have to pass by the big pile of rocks and say, am I ready to war with a people whose God does this? So Jericho needs to happen for all of us, right? In my life, there are times when God has done amazing things. God has freed me from bondage to different things, where God has blessed me. And then years pass, and I look back, and I look at what's happening right now, and what's happening right now, I totally forget about the provision of God in the past. And so there's times that I need something. I need a big pile of rocks. I need something to remind me of what God did. I need something sometimes to remind me that you don't need to go down that road. God freed you, God did that. You don't need to go there again. Sometimes we need a Jericho in our own life. So, Landon is going to come out and play another song. And I just wanted for you to take a moment and think back on your life. Think of what has God done for you. And maybe it would be a good idea to write something of a reminder to yourself on a card and stick it on your dashboard or on your mirror, or something that can be your Jericho, something that you're going to pass by that can remind you of what God has done, but not just what God has done, but what He will do. Let's pray. God, we thank you. We thank you for the fact that Jericho didn't just happen 3,500 years ago, but it happens today. It happens in our own life. Where you will come and you'll tear down the walls. You'll do something for us that we couldn't do for ourselves. God, we thank you for that. We thank you for the moments in our past when we've done that. And God, we confess that the distance and time sometimes has allowed us to forget. And so we ask for your forgiveness. God, in the next few moments, would you remind us? Would you bring back to our memory those moments you've provided for us, those moments of unusual blessing or unusual freedom? Help us to make some piles of rocks in our life that we would not repeat the sin of forgetting. But instead we would remember. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Our God is a consuming fire, burning